Welcome, NutritionRadio.org listeners. This is Lonnie Lowry, University Nutrition Professor of over 20 years and podcast host of long-running shows like IronRadio. Come on in. Lecture time. Hey, everybody. This time I would like to go back in time for a lecture, sort of a Q&A seminar that I was doing about overtraining, overreaching and overtraining. Obviously, this has a sports nutrition slant. That's sort of my jam. But there's a lot of connection here to different dietary supplements and that kind of thing. This is from a few years ago, but it lays down some interesting definitions and possible dietary supplements. The prevalence of overreaching and overtraining is quite high. I'm going to speak very broad brush here, but maybe a third to a half of athletes, depending on what level they are at and if it's an individual or a team sport. But being proactive with your recovery as you exercise a lot, for those of you who do, it's really very important. There's even spreadsheets I've developed before based on some work from Ken Ta and Kelman about how to look at your body like a business, and how a lot of coaches, they would just drive their athletes into bankruptcy in this metaphor because they don't put back in a proactive way. By putting back, I mean meals, stretching, sleep, including naps, hot-cold contrast baths or showers. There's just any number of things, psychological techniques, meditation, putting things back as you expend your resources. So come on in for this seminar. It's a couple of years old now. This information is still, of course, good. Studies don't invalidate after 3 or 4 years, for goodness sake. And that's what this really does. I'm focusing on a couple of recent papers at the time and what they might mean for the prevention or maybe even the treatment on some level of overreaching and overtraining. Let's go have a listen.
I want to start off today by talking just about that, about some of the new data that I've been looking at regarding overreaching and overtraining. And maybe first I should really make some definitions here. Overreaching is actually a good thing when it's planned and it's purposeful. I mean, we have to ask the human body to do more than it's used to. Otherwise, why would it adapt? But overreaching can start to become unproductive and problematic, and then it's kind of a precursor to actual full-blown overtraining. And even overtraining can progress into what's called overtraining syndrome. And I know what that feels like firsthand. It's a very emotionally depressing mononucleosis kind of almost illness, and it can really crush you. I mean, if anybody's in this group's had mono before, you know, you can literally lay on the couch for a month. And now, many people are quick to point out that, well, overtraining, true overtraining syndrome doesn't happen in many people, and they'd be correct in that. But it does happen, and it can, at least the early stages of it can happen very quickly. I'm looking at a paper in front of me right now by one of the true kings of overtraining research. It's good to see him publishing again. It's Andy Fry. And this is really interesting stuff. He does a lot of work with Bill Kramer. You may be familiar with him too. But what Fry looks at is a specific kind of overtraining, or at least he differentiates the different kinds. Instead of a volume kind of overtraining, which is called parasympathetic overtraining, and is kind of an exhaustion in a way, that might occur in, well, for example, I gave a talk to some swimmers last week, and they were almost assuredly in the early stages of volume or endurance kinds of overtraining, that parasympathetic overtraining. But Andy Fry looks at the intensity kind of overtraining that often occurs in resistance athletes. So that's why I want to talk about this one a little bit to this group. The interesting thing about this, I'll just give you the title, it's beta-2 adrenaline receptor downregulation during high-intensity exercise overtraining. What he does here is he has these guys, one group exercise normally, and another group he purposely sends them into, at the very least, the early stages of overreaching, if not overtraining. And he has them doing that with 10 maxes. So he does 10 one-rep maxes every day for 2 weeks. And in that extreme way, he can drive these guys into overtraining in 2 weeks' time. And the interesting thing about this paper is that the muscle beta-2 receptors, the adrenaline receptors, significantly decreased by 37%. And you might say, well, so what? What's a beta receptor? Maybe some of you know, but that kind of adrenaline receptor is what's targeted by different performance and physique-enhancing drugs like clenbuterol. There's a couple of different asthma-type drugs that target those. So those have been demonstrated very clearly to have effects on body fat mass, and to have a 37% reduction in them because of overtraining. Again, this sympathetic kind of overtraining, or this intensity type, jacks up your adrenaline, your epinephrine levels, and wears down your beta receptor number. And that's Journal of Applied Physiology. It's really a Tier 1 journal. So I thought that one was really interesting. So a lot of the guys who, I imagine the people who use like ephedra, or there are different kinds of adrenergic agents, and they're using it for fat loss. And here your ability to respond to those is 37% decreased because you got your body on such this almost like overdrive. I look at this sympathetic kind of overtraining as like overdrive, right? I mean, every day you're doing 10 reps at your max, and you just get your adrenaline levels up, and you kind of can't get them down. Because what we're looking at here is it almost suggests a decrease. Well, it does suggest a decreased responsiveness to stimulants, because you're burnt. I mean, your tissues have this 37% less ability to even respond. And what that leads to is also decreased muscular performance, because, I mean, here there was a 36.3% decrease in mean power at the 1 rep max load. So big decreases in performance. You can do that within 2 weeks, and when you couple that with some of the data that's been out for a long time, that it can take more than 8 weeks to get back on track, I mean, as far as all the different variables are concerned, damn. So yeah, here's me talking about responsiveness to stimulant, dietary kinds of stimulant things, but yeah, what about your natural stimulant, epinephrine? Your performance is down, and it's probably on no small measure because the muscles can't respond to that kind of power coming at them, hormonal power anymore. Interesting stuff. Let's see what else we have here. This is yet another variable. This is something I might look at myself because I've been taking a look at this lately anyway. But this is a paper from a clinical, it's a hematology microcirculation journal, which is a little esoteric, but it's entitled, "Is Plasma Viscosity a Predictor of Overtraining in Athletes?" And the interesting thing here is that you can actually look at, there is a raised hematocrit. If you take a little blood sample, you spin it down in a centrifuge, right, all the packed cells go down to the end, and that's your hematocrit. And it looks like when normally athletes do that, you get what looks like a reduction in hematocrit because your plasma volume, the watery part of your blood, raises. But in early overtraining, it looks like you can actually use raised hematocrit as an early marker. At the end, they just say, these results show that this kind of blood viscosity is a rather specific, although it might be a poorly sensitive predictor of overreaching. Pretty cool stuff. You can look at the thickness of your blood, your hematocrit, and that may be yet another marker. I mean, there's psychological markers. There's lots of blood markers now. Let's see. There was one other I wanted to talk about, and this is a supplemental one. This is from Sports Med. It's 2006 paper from Kingsley. It's the effects of phosphatidylserine supplementation on exercising humans. And I just wanted to read this quote. Early research indicated that oral supplementation with phosphatidylserine at 800 milligrams per day moderated exercise-induced changes in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So just the whole hormonal stress response was modified by this. Subsequently, this finding was extended to suggest that perhaps phosphatidylserine at 800 milligrams per day could reduce cortisol response to overtraining during weight training. So they're specifically talking about weight training overtraining. And again, you don't see that quite as much as you do volume type overtraining that you might see in runners and swimmers and whatnot. So this is suggesting that phosphatidylserine could actually reduce the hormonal stress response, cortisol, and the whole axis thing. It says, however, equivocal findings from our lab might suggest that the dose required to undertake this neuroendocrine action may vary greatly between participants. So 800 milligrams plus or minus, it looks like there's some kind of effect with this PS. And, phosphatidylserine's been on the market for quite some time, but here we've got a remember, science is playing catch-up a lot of times, so what we think we know is really still just early stage stuff. And this is suggesting that the early research does suggest that phosphatidylserine around this 800 milligram per day dose, depending on the person, could improve exercise capacity with against high-intensity cycling, for example, or increase performance. So pretty cool stuff. I always try to keep my eye open on the different supplements that are coming out. This is looks like it's an English study. It's from Great Britain. But phosphatidylserine, reducing the stress response to overtraining, specifically lifting-type overtraining.
Okay, so I know that was a little advanced. I know a lot of the nutritionradio.org listeners are advanced, and even when you're not, I find that just talking just a half a notch up, people tend to rise to that occasion. I continue to be interested in things like phosphatidylserine, phosphatidylcholine, and there are many nutritional approaches from fish oils to properly timed carbohydrates when it comes to trying to reduce that stress response. In any case, I hope that was interesting. If you have any comments or you want to hear more about overreaching and overtraining, I don't know how many nutritionradio.org listeners are athletes that train that hard, but it does happen. I know it happens, and I always appreciate feedback. If you want to, you could find the YouTube backup. It's Lawnman07 on YouTube. And please, as always, consider a little review on iTunes. It really helps us a lot. So I know that people are there and they want to keep listening, and we'll keep this whole nutritionradio.org thing going. We'll see you next time for another brief installment. The nutritionradio.org podcast is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, check with your physician, nutritionist, or qualified exercise physiologist in order to make the progress that you need.